He divides the 20th century into three periods. So I'll divide it like I did when I was talking about Alan Young, okay, into three acts. Okay, each of these periods is an act in a drama that is maybe a tragedy. We'll see. Act one is he has going from 1900 to 1933. And is that right, 1900? Yeah, 1900 and 1933. And this is about, in his story, he in fact calls it the confrontation of the Fed and the gold standard. This confrontation doesn't really begin until after World War I. There is this gold standard that exists before there. The Fed is created in 1913, but almost immediately there's a world war. And during the World War, all countries go off gold except the U.S. And it's no great feat for the U.S. to stay on gold because all the gold was flowing to the U.S. to pay for war material from Europe. So at the end of the war, the situation is this. So this is after World War I. Okay. There's an attempt to return to gold. We have gold as the international currency. The dollar is still tied to gold. And then there's domestic deposits and credit. Okay, so there's this hierarchy that lasts through the war and is there when the war ends. There has been some inflation during wartime, so that the gold standard has not in fact disciplined the U.S. because all the gold is flowing in. All the gold is flowing in. So there's nothing there, but the discipline is reimposed after the war, and there's some deflation, falling price level in the U.S., but not as much to return to the pre-war parities for the dollar. That's in 1920, 21. And there's a decision to return to gold for all the other currencies. So you have the Deutschmark, okay, you have the pound sterling, okay, you have the French franc, okay, and all of the credit underneath them, okay. And one by one, there's a decision to let's just link gold to them as well. Let them return to gold. Not all of them at the pre-war parities, particularly the French devalued their currency, but there's an attempt to get back to, to say, well, World War I, that was exceptional. Let's get back to the way it was beforehand. What Mundell emphasizes here is that as you are relinking up the system, okay, each additional currency that you add creates a greater demand for gold. Okay, if you're not on a gold standard, you don't have to have gold reserves. You don't need them. Okay, but if you're linking to gold, you need more gold reserves. So as each additional currency links up, okay, there's an increased demand for gold. And gold, okay, becomes increasingly scarce, increasingly undervalued. So here's the first time where you could have revalued gold to solve that problem, and you didn't. You didn't. Gold gets increasingly scarce. That implies deflationary pressure on these economies. Okay. If gold becomes more valuable, there's two ways to make there be more gold. You could just by fiat raise the price of gold, or you can keep the price of gold and lower the price of everything else. Okay, and that's what deflation is doing there, and that's bad for the economies, and so it's resisted by these national central banks. It's resisted by these national central banks. They're not allowing this deflation to happen. In 1931, the key mistake, according to Mundell, was made by the Fed in 1931. when the Fed tried to defend the gold standard by raising interest rates in the middle of a deflationary episode. Okay, so it adds insult to injury there. By increasing interest rates from, these sound like ridiculously small numbers, from 1.5% to 3.5%. But this is in a deflationary period, so these are very high real interest rates here. And the consequence is to make gold even more scarce because all the gold is flowing into the U.S., okay, to being attracted by these high interest rates. And that forces all of these different countries to go off of gold, to drop that, and eventually the U.S. does as well, and there's a worldwide depression. Now, this is a mistake that the Fed did this, defending the gold standard, because in trying to maintain the parity between the dollar and gold, okay, by raising interest rates, it wound up destroying the gold standard. Okay, so that's one aspect of the mistake, that it made it impossible for the other countries to survive. They should have coordinated on revaluing gold, in Mundel's idea. The other problem, which was more domestic, is that by defending the gold standard, the Fed wound up sacrificing the U.S. banking system. Okay, and so the banking system all collapsed in the United States, and and FDR got elected, and we had all the banking legislation that was created in the 30s as a consequence of that. So this mistake had very widespread repercussions for the United States and for the world. Now, you would think that would be enough, but let me just draw your attention to this passage here, page 331. He says, had the price of gold been raised in the late 20s, so this is the revaluation, or alternatively, had major central banks pursued policies of price stability instead of adhering to the gold standard, so that is allowing their currencies to float, okay, instead of adhering to the gold standard, there would have been no Great Depression, no Nazi revolution, and no World War II. Okay. So this is an international monetary standard theory of history, as far as I can see, okay? And perhaps he goes a bit overboard there, okay? Or we can say he does go a bit overboard there. But it's to make a point. It's this point about integration and stability, okay? That if you're that instability in the world polity, okay, and instability in the world monetary system are tied together. Now, as a student of politics, I would say the reason why we couldn't get together to do the right thing was in fact because the politics didn't work. Okay, so it's not like if we had gotten together and done the right thing, we wouldn't have had these wars. Well, if we'd been able to get together and do the right thing, okay, we wouldn't have had these wars, but we weren't able to, and so these are symptoms of the same thing, really. But it makes it dramatic, and I kind of like that, actually, as a money guy myself. It's dramatic reading, creating a story of the 20th century that's entirely about international monetary errors of one kind or other, and causing Nazism. Yes, Jay?
Can I ask a question? You said that the attempt to defend the gold standard hurt the American banking sector. Could you explain how that was the case?
Well, okay, so there are two par relationships that we're concerned with here. One is the mint par here, okay, and the other is the deposit par here. Okay, by maintaining this par, okay, you sacrifice this one, okay, meaning that the banks were unable to keep their deposits at par with currency, and so they closed. You know, there's a run on the bank. That's what that means. People would rather hold currency than deposits, so there's a run on the bank, and the banking system closes. Alternatively, you could have abandoned that par, okay, and let the say we're not going to pay in gold anymore. We're going to maintain this par, okay, and we're going to support the banks by being a lender of last resort to them, okay. But you can't do both, okay. You can either be a lender of last resort to your domestic banks, or you can defend the dollar's value in world markets, not both. Those are opposite policies. This is an interesting theory. Some people go farther than that and say, well, why did the Fed make this mistake? Okay, why did it do that? The New York Fed was run by a guy named Benjamin Strong, and he knew all the central bankers in the world. He was a very accomplished central banker. And one of his advisors was Alan Young, as a matter of fact, who was at Harvard. Okay? But in I forget exactly when it was, but Benjamin Strong died of tuberculosis, okay, in the late 20s. I think it was 1929. I'd have to check the date. So he was not around in 1931. And Alan Young died of the flu, actually, in London in 1929, okay? So people were not, and this is not a very long, not a very deep bench, okay, in the Fed. It's just been around for a decade or so. And so when it came to this crisis, there's a lot of knee-jerk, well, what do we have to do? We got to be conservative bankers. We have to defend the gold standard. That's what we need to do. We need to defend the gold standard. And it required more bold action than that. And there was no one at the Fed to do that. And so they did the wrong thing. People do tell this story that if Benjamin Strong had been alive, maybe the Depression wouldn't have happened. We'll never know. We'll never know. There's a nice biography of Benjamin Strong, by the way, that you can read. I think that makes this kind of argument. So that's the first act, and it's certainly a tragedy. There's a confrontation of the Fed and the gold standard, and the consequence is the collapse of the gold standard.